current doctoral student in ESR. She's a professional events manager and loves creating spaces for people to transform and grow. And her dissertation is at the intersection of philosophy and ecology with a special focus on trees. So let's welcome Laura.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. So this presentation is a review of the historical and current philosophy regarding plants. So I'll just kind of be broadly following the arc of my upcoming dissertation, which is tentatively titled Arboreality, a New Phenomenology of Trees. And so I like to link this philosophy of our ideas of ourselves, of humans in the Western philosophical lineage, and use this way of thinking to address environmental crisis by proposing a participatory cosmology. So that's kind of the broad overview of what I'm hoping to do, and much of it is still really being worked out. I'm still really figuring out how this is all going to go, so I'd love comments and feedback. And in this presentation, I'll be sticking to individual philosophers quite a bit and going over their ideas. So as Chad mentioned in his presentation, in order to move forward, we do need to understand the past. And philosophers have always addressed plants. And so even in Socrates, he had said, "I'm a lover of knowledge, and the men who dwell in the city are my teachers, not the trees or the country." So this, at the very kind of inception of our philosophical lineage here in the West, creates this dynamic between the knowledge as within the human. I'm going to, for the moment, give him that, and not in the non-human, in the plants or in the country. And so then pretty quickly we get this breakdown in philosophy between humans, which is often seen as man, animals, and plants as the kind of realm of the living. That's a pretty common distinction. And it does start with Plato, and Plato does some things with that. I'm actually just going to go ahead and skip ahead to Aristotle, where this really gets crystallized. So he talks about these as different souls. And he says this faculty, the nutritive soul, can be separated from the others, but the others cannot be separated from this immortal things. And this is obvious in the case of plants, as they have no other potentiality of soul. So that's kind of the basis of soul, and there is no opportunity for something like plants to have rationality, meaning they can't ever provide any kind of knowledge. And that actually, and a lot of this is, I just want to mention, from Matthew Hall's Plants as Persons. So he really traces this lineage. There are some philosophers who give a more positive view of plants. I'm focusing on the ones that have led to our more mainstream Western view, because I think that's what has led to the environmental predicament that we're in. So that's kind of why I'm focusing on these more denigrative plant philosophies. And then skipping ahead quite a bit into our more modern era, René Descartes, our forefather of the mechanistic worldview, actually barely mentions plants at all in any of his philosophy. And the plants in his world are fully backgrounded in Val Plumwood's sense, meaning they're just not even part of his purview. They just are part of the environment, to use that term, in that particular way. However, John Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, also reiterates this distinction between plants, animals, and humans. He says an oak, which is interesting that he uses a particular tree, has an organization of its parts that is fit to receive and distribute nourishment so as to continue and frame the wood, bark, and leaves. And this is kind of an only situation. So, and he does say that plants are living as opposed to just a mass of matter like a rock, but only as far as they're able to receive nourishment. So that's kind of the only thing that they're able to do. And just as a side note, this essay is actually the first time that the word consciousness was used in the philosophical lineage in the sense of awareness. So that's also a sense there. So moving on to something, I want to talk about the relational aspect and kind of the philosophy of the plant. The relational theories have been proposed by philosophers and others for decades, and I think it's a really compelling way to think about it, especially in terms of ethics. So Erazim Kohak, I apologize if I'm saying his name incorrectly, he's an ecophenomenologist. So ecophenomenology is kind of literally the study of the phenomenon of home. And phenomenology is this engagement with the sensual perception while holding back preconceptions and really understanding phenomena from this fresh place. And it brings in this evocative and kind of very feeling writing style that Koik is wonderful at, and just gives such a great sense. And it's really from his connection with the forests that he writes. He advances a relational-based ethic with personhood and develops personalism. So he said, so personalism in his definition, I don't have this quote up, but I'm going to read it. A foundationalism of the overt, a conviction that, once stripped of the veil of artifacts and constructs, our daytime consciousness is fundamentally veridical, and that reality it presents to us, value-laden and meaningfully ordered, is true reality. So he's assuming this meaning sense that brings us into a universe of personhood, so personalism. And that brings him to his morality. And then he says it is precisely in investing in life, love, and labor that we constitute the world as personal, this place of intimate dwelling. And so he's just one of many philosophers who developed this relational philosophy and bring forward an ethical stance from it. The next person that I'd love to talk about is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an ecologist, a professional ecologist, and author of Braiding Sweetgrass. She talks a lot about indigenous views of non-human relationality. And this quote, traditional indigenous harvesters recognize the individuality of each tree as a person, a non-human forest person, is from the, excuse me if I'm saying this wrong, Potawatomi basket makers who use those trees. And then in her view, recognizing the trees here as people really changes the relationship of the humans to the forest. So I would recommend her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Overall, it's just an amazing work. And one of the things that really touched me about that book and her stories is a story that she tells about one of her graduate students who, so in this, the sweetgrass is a plant that's harvested by different indigenous groups, and some of the indigenous peoples harvest it by pulling up by the roots, and some of them harvest it by cutting the plant off. And so there was an argument that one way was better than the other. So her graduate student decided to undertake a study to see which one actually helped the plant thrive and survive in a better way. So the graduate student set out different plots, some where she created different ways to pull out the plant, some where she cut them off, and some where she left them alone. And so the other advisors were saying, well, we're not sure, but definitely the ones that you've left alone are going to be the ones that are thriving, because when there are no people, that's when plants really thrive. And the surprise in her study was that actually it didn't really matter which way the plants were pulled up, whether they were pulled up by the roots or whether they were cut off. Either way, both plots seemed to thrive. The plot that didn't thrive was the control plot, where there was no interaction and no kind of relationship built between the person and the plant. So that example I find to be really, really evocative and a way to see how the relationship can really build our understanding, and then also can be two-way, that it could be good for the plants as well as for us. So, and in the relational philosophy, it's in the ones that I've read are more ethically focused. However, there are some philosophers recently who are focusing more on epistemology and ontology. So I'm next, oops, what happened? Oops, sorry. Okay. Alain Miller, who wrote The Vegetative Soul, proposes a vegetative philosophy in her work. So she talks about this vegetative soul or vegetable genius, which is a nod to Aristotle, as a fruitful alternative to the figure of the modern subject. But I find what's most kind of exciting about her work is that she proposes a plant-like reading of philosophy that I think kind of gives us a different window into the philosophic perspective. And so here she says, a plant-like reading might unfold something like this. One may start with an idea, or start with a very straightforward reading of a text. Then the seed metamorphoses into a stem, node, or leaf. And without any specific intention on the part of the author, it begins to transform itself into something else. A true philosophical reading can perhaps never be envisioned from the outset. And so her entire work is her plant-like reading of various authors like Goethe and Kant and Nietzsche. And however, I don't feel like she really fully develops this vegetative philosophy in her work, and remaining focused instead on the subject and the plant-like philosophy, whereas I think that more can be said kind of about a plant-like ontology. So the other author that I'd like to talk about is Michael Martyr, who has written a book called Plant Thinking. And he attempts to create a philosophical position from the plant realm in a philosophic biomimicry. So he directly employs phenomenology and other philosophical perspectives. He says, all we can hope for is to brush upon the edges of plant being, which is altogether outer and exposed, and in doing so, grow past the fictitious shells of our identity and our existential ontology. And here's where I think it gets really juicy, because so much of our ontology, so much of our understanding of being is anthropocentric. It's focused on ourselves. It's focused from the center of the individual human person. And what's it like to think about that? I mean, that's our perception, that's our perspective, but what's it like to think about that from a very, very other perspective, from plants, particularly trees, which are so much larger and older than we are? What will that bring to an ontology? However, I think Martyr falls a little short of this. He claims plant thinking is non-conscious intentionality, and that offers meaning even in the absence of consciousness. So he doesn't give plants consciousness. And he also, I think part of this is because of he doesn't address recent studies in plant biology. I think his ecological understanding is a little bit limited, and so for example, some of the things Chantal shared with us, I think will give a different view into those ideas. And he also maintains the traditional philosophic dualism between the animal and human and the plant. Okay. And it's promising, but I think that more can be done here. And so this kind of leads to my work and what I'm hoping to propose, and this is leading into kind of the edge for me. There we go. So I'm hoping to propose a participatory cosmology and build on the work of people like Owen Barfield, if you're familiar with his Saving the Appearances. And so for now, I've kind of defined this as a paradigm which intentionally engages systems to relate to a cosmos populated by beings. And if I knew what I really meant by that, I would have finished my dissertation. So ongoing to be developed. But I think the participatory cosmology really expands the relational view into a systemic perspective. And the relational view is really important, and it typically stays, at least in the philosophy that I've read, on a one-to-one level of one individual human and one individual animal or plant. And again, that's super important, but I think there's more that can be done in the Western lineage, which is kind of where I'm focused. And I do think that there are a lot of other cultural knowledge lineages that already have this. So I think that we, as a Western, from the Western perspective, need to do more to generate this in order to kind of help stem the tide of environmental crisis that we're experiencing in depth right now and continues to deepen. And I think that this moves us towards what Thomas Berry would call the communion of subjects. So that is, thank you. It. Oh. And here are my sources in case, what happened? If anybody wants to see my sources, I can give them to you. It's not pulling up right now. There it goes. All right. Any questions?
Goethe's work on metamorphosis of plants and gentle empiricism, which is so paradigmatic for, it seems, at least in the West. Are you exploring that lineage at all?
I am, yeah.
I mean, I guess that goes into Barfield for one, but what about the others?
Yeah, I am definitely exploring Goethe's work extensively, and I'll be using phenomenology to kind of open into this, and so I'll be using Goethe's work within the within the phenomenological framework. He's kind of a pre-phenomenologist in a way, in my view. But his theory is incredible, and it's too bad that he's seen so much as a poet and not as much as a scientist. But agreed, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. Can you explain what's your relationship to a tree or a plant is, also an experiential way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's hard to describe because I actually think that relationships to non-humans are very similar to humans. So I have some trees that I know really well and that I, have relationship with, and then some trees that I don't. And I think it's a mistake to assume that if you go up, I think some people think of like, oh, I'm gonna go tree hug and I'm just gonna go up and tell this tree all my problems. Like, how do you know the tree's interested? So I think it's I think that relationship has to be built as any relationship has to, and maintained. So, yeah, thanks.
I've been inspired and challenged by Martyr as well in his perspective in plant thinking, and he's got another book that came out more recently that you might want to check out, The Philosopher's Plant, where he goes through the history of philosophy and chooses key thinkers and examines how they both tended to put down plants in some points, and then these sort of cracks in that habit of denigrating that allow some new appreciation to blossom forth, as it were. And I think he has some updated plant biology in there too that might help address your concerns with this first book. So, yeah, just another source you might check out.
Yeah, thanks. And Matthew Hall also has quite a few sources that are more positive. I think theophrasis, if I'm remembering correctly.
What was it?
Is it? I'm probably saying it wrong. Theophrasis?
Theophrastus.
Theophrastus. I think had a very positive I guess I'm framing it positively for my work, but kind of a more conscious and intentional plant philosophy. But I didn't focus on that here.
Like one of those places where there's a crack in a thinker who might otherwise seem to be more anthropocentric would be where Plato characterizes the human being as an upside-down plant, Timaeus.
Right.
So that we're more like plants than we might otherwise imagine, given this kind of Aristotelian ontology that puts the rational soul up here.
Well, yeah, I'd love to hear more at some point too. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oh.
Do we have time? I don't know.
I'll talk about it then.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
And it is now time for lunch, and we will resume at 2.